We need to learn what our needs are. Everybody has needs in a relationship, and actually needs in a relationship are so understated.
Thais Gibson
is a relationship coach, best-selling author,
and the founder of
Personal Development School.
The analogy I often give to people is somebody with a different attachment style than you. It's almost like you sit down to play a board game and you have the rules for Monopoly and I have the rules for Scrabble. It's gonna cause like a lot of unnecessary misunderstandings. It's safe to express emotions. It's okay to be vulnerable, to rely on other people, and to trust them. They get this really healthy modeling, and as they grow older, they also get modeling for how to communicate and negotiate their needs and how to have healthy boundaries.
I'm Radhi Devlukia, and on my podcast, A Really Good Cry, we embrace the real, the messy, and the beautiful, providing a space for raw, unfiltered conversations that celebrate vulnerability and allow you to tune in to learn, connect, and find comfort together. Thais, thank you so much for being here. I am so grateful to you. I have been binge reading your books, and I am so grateful that you have done so much of the work for us so we can understand things so simply through your words. And I just want to get straight into it. So tell me how you started learning about attachment theory and what got you interested in it.
So I grew up in like a very chaotic household for sure. And I was a very sensitive child. So I have a younger sister. And I think as a child, I was parentified a lot. So I was kind of put in the middle of a lot of the chaos and the drama. My parents went through like a 20-year divorce. It went to the Superior Court of Canada. Just one of those things. And I think I grew up as like this sensitive person kind of thinking, like, why can't it be different? Why do people who love each other, and I knew they really cared about each other and they were very loving, like my parents are very good-hearted people, but they just really brought out really difficult sort of sides to one another. And so I think from a very young age, I was really interested in human behavior. I think it's difficult. I'm not recommending that people parentify their children and put them in the middle of things. But I think the silver lining for me was that I actually really love human behavior and learning about people. And I think from a young age, I was kind of immersed in this environment where I was, in a sense, being forced to learn about a lot of why people do the things that they do. And I became very curious at a young age. And so I internalized a lot, went through my own sort of struggles, both personally and in relationships, and then did a lot of healing work and was like, how can I go into my adult life feeling like relationships aren't scary and aren't so chaotic and so difficult? And a lot of the work and healing that I had to do with myself ended up being the things that actually brought me into this sort of realm of work later on. So a big part of my focus became, okay, well, how can I go into not just how we understand our attachment styles, but how can we change them? Because I was a fearful avoidant attachment style, which is a tricky one. And I was very hot and cold. And I think at that point it was like, well, I don't want to live like this forever and feel like relationships are difficult like this. And so doing that work with myself first and becoming securely attached then allowed me to bring that out to other people as well.
And what was your first experience with attachment styles? And just, you know what, before we do that, could you just give everybody that's listening an overview of what attachment theory is?
Yes,
because I feel like we're using the term and people are going to be like, wait, what is that?
Absolutely. So attachment theory, we can think of it in a simplified manner as being basically the subconscious set of rules you have for love. So if you
I love that.
And it's sort of like we all have this rule book, and the analogy I often give to people is somebody with a different attachment style than you. It's almost like you sit down to play a board game and you have the rules for Monopoly and I have the rules for Scrabble. And it's going to cause like a lot of unnecessary friction and misunderstandings and miscommunications because we're like, what do you mean? We're supposed to be doing it this way. And so that's really what our attachment style is. And it was originally, the body of work was originally born from John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth out of Cambridge University decades ago. And then a lot of that original research I learned in like first year psych at university, but it's sort of like, it's really profound in a sense, but it talks about the 4 attachment styles, but it doesn't talk about how we can change our attachment style, how we can become secure, how we can recondition basically. And we know we have neuroplasticity. And so because of that, we can change our attachment style. So that's where our body of work was born from there. But the 4 major attachment styles out of John Bowlby's work are, number 1, the securely attached child. Securely attached children obviously grow up as secure adults, and they grow up in a household where there's a lot of what we call approach-oriented behaviors. So basically, there's a lot of when a child is in distress, crying, feeling sad, the parent will go towards them. And through those approach-oriented behaviors, it actually conditions the child to feel like, I'm worthy of love. It's safe to express emotions.
Yeah.
My needs will get met if I express emotions. It's okay to be vulnerable, to rely on other people, and to trust them. And so they get this really healthy modeling. And as they grow older, they also get modeling for how to communicate and negotiate their needs and how to have healthy boundaries. So they grow up to have that framework to become really secure adults because of that framework model to them as children.
Yes.
And then there's the 3 insecure attachment styles. One is the anxious preoccupied. This is somebody that tends to have a lot of either real or perceived abandonment in childhood. So it can be that they either literally go through an abandonment where a parent is divorced and they kind of move out of the household and they're not around very much, or it can also be a lot of very loving emotions and actions from caregivers, but maybe they're working all the time. So it's sort of like,
Okay.
So it's like love is there, love is taken away. Love is there, love is taken away. And that repetition and emotion fires and wires those neural pathways for a person to constantly fear abandonment.
Wow.
And fear that the other shoe will drop. And so they become the clingy individuals sometimes in adult relationships because that's their way of trying to cope and maintain proximity.
Yeah. And then, okay, so that was there's 2 more, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
go through them, and then we're going to go through them in depth. But I feel like if they hear the terms, it'll be really useful to when we're going back through it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So on the other end of the spectrum, there's the dismissive avoidant. Dismissive avoidants usually grow up with the overarching theme being childhood emotional neglect, and sometimes even enmeshment. And so childhood emotional neglect causes a child when they're very young to go, something must be wrong with me that I can't get my needs met, because we're literally wired for attunement, for connection, for emotional responding from our caregivers. And so a child internalizes it because every child internalizes everything. That's how the mind works when they're learning. And so a child can't go, oh, my parents are emotionally unavailable. So instead they go, something must be wrong with me.
Yeah.
And so they tend to be the ones that are afraid to even bond too much in terms of relationships. And they constantly keep people at bay and try to keep a distance because they don't want to feel like that again as adults. And so that's our dismissive avoidant. They tend to fear commitment as adults. They tend to sort of be a little slower to warm up, a little more standoffish.
Yeah.
And last but not least is the fearful avoidant. This is what I was. Fearful avoidants grow up usually in chaotic childhood. So it can be a lot of fighting in the home. It can be parentification, but it can also be more extreme things like having a cluster B personality disordered parent, somebody with borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. Or it can also be that you have parents who maybe struggle with addiction. And basically the overarching theme is like you have some really good moments with love and connection, some really nice ones, but some really scary ones or kind of horrific ones. And so you never know what you're going to get. And if you imagine like an example of a parent who's an addict, let's say mom's an alcoholic as an example. One day, mom comes home, she's had too much to drink, she's scary, she's confusing. Another day, she's had too much to drink, she's in a great mood. Another day, she's sobering up and she's in a really bad mood, she's detoxing. Another day, she's sober and she feels guilty about her behavior, so she's kind. And it's like you just don't know what you're going to get at any point in time. And so a child like that grows up in a household and then feels as an adult like they want love, but when it gets too close, they get scared. And so they're very hot and cold and push and pull. And it's sort of like, come here, come here. Somebody gets closer, like, get back.
Yeah.
And so they give a lot of mixed messages because a lot of that is like the internal feelings that they're carrying and responding to. So those are the four major.
Thank you. That was really informative. And I feel like when I read through your book and I was reading through all these attachment styles, I could think of different people in my life who carry different qualities. And what it really made me think was, God, it helps me feel so much empathy towards the people in my life. Not even just empathy, but understanding of myself, understanding of other people, but so much more compassion for it. And I think that these styles help you to connect, not just to your partner, not just to your parents, but every single person that you come into contact with. You can kind of start understanding their behavior and therefore have more of a compassionate nature where you're thinking, this all stems from like a child that was either neglected or grew up in a really difficult environment, and those things are being carried with us. So how does one go from, hearing this, where you hear what the attachment styles are and being like, oh, this is me, or oh, this is my partner, this is my mom. What do we then do about it? Like how did you start to heal yourself? And what were you said you did a lot of healing work. What were the healing techniques that really helped you? And how do we move through these towards being a secure can everyone be as secure?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody can be securely attached. It does require work. Like I would say the caveat is if somebody's not really willing to do the work, then that's where the sort of the glass ceiling arises. But so I first started in client practice after doing a lot of my own work. And I saw over the course of about a decade, I went through almost 18,000 client sessions. And if people were willing to do the work, people would become secure. If somebody came in and they were willing, but they dragged in their partner who was unwilling, that would be where like that there's not much you can do past that. So my original background was actually, I came out of school for psychology, went into specializing in hypnosis. And I really wanted to learn how we can really change our subconscious mind. So one of the things I learned in school was that your conscious mind cannot outwill or overpower your subconscious mind, which to me was like mind-blowing because it was like, oh, that's why everybody every New Year's is like, I'm going to quit eating chocolate, and 7 days later, they're back to the same thing. Or we set all these goals, but we don't follow through. Well, it's because we're not engaging the subconscious mind in the process of transformation. So I got into hypnotherapy, did like this year-long certification and all of that, did a lot of like NLP, a lot of these things to really understand how the mind works, and then started doing client sessions with hypnosis and was like I thought the power dynamics were strange. I felt like it was like give the man a fish instead of teach the man to fish. And I was like, well, I'd rather spend time telling people how their subconscious works and how they can recondition it. Because when you look at hypnosis and you pair that with neuroplasticity research, there's like a science behind transformation. So there's a lot of tools we can use to change our subconscious mind, which is how the needle actually moves. So what I found over about 10 years of working with people was that there's basically 4 major categories and 2 kind of minor ones that we have to focus on in order to become securely attached. The first is reprogramming our core wounds. So we all have core wounds, and they're basically like our relationship baggage. So if I grew up, for example, for me, I grew up in an environment where there was a lot of chaos. And so I really had a hard time trusting because I was kind of like, if my parents are betraying trust, like how will I trust anybody? And so, that's an I am betrayed core wound. And each attachment style actually has very unique core wounds. Anxious attachments have more like I'll be abandoned, I'll be alone, excluded, disliked, rejected. Dismissive avoidance are more like I'll be seen as defective or something's wrong with me because of that internalized shame wound. I'll be weak if I'm vulnerable. It's unsafe to open up. I'll be trapped, helpless, powerless. Fearful avoidance basically have both sides because they have that anxious and avoidance. So a little more core wound reprogramming, but they also have this core wound of I'll be betrayed, I'm unworthy, and I am bad, like feeling like people will get them in trouble or punish them for no reason. So a lot of the first work I did just of my own accord was doing a ton of core wound reprogramming, which is based in how we can sort of self-hypnotize when awake. It's not like really in a process of hypnosis at all. It's just a process of like firing and wiring neural pathways. We can always talk about like a tool or something later. There's some really easy takeaways that people could get started on immediately who are listening. So first we have to get all of those ideas out of our subconscious mind, because if I'm going into trying to love somebody and I'm like, well, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be abandoned, I'm going to be trapped, and all these fears are there, then it makes it really difficult to let our guard down or to feel normal. So we have to recondition those ideas. We're not born with them. They get conditioned into us. We can recondition them of the same accord.
And so I guess that first step, what I'm hearing from you is identifying, like learning and learning yourself and identifying what is my mind thinking in that moment. Like noticing it. Because I think a lot of us go on autopilot. If you've had it from such a young age, I'm going into a room, whether it's with my partner or whether it's with my friends, and the first thing I'm thinking is, oh, if I act in this way, they're not going to like me. Like, let's say that's the initial thought that comes into my mind, but you become so used to having those thoughts that they don't feel abnormal. They feel so part of you. They feel like they are your normality. And so I think, the identifying part is so important, where you actually start listening and hearing what is going through my mind as I'm going through the world. What is going through my mind as I'm interacting with my partner, with my close friends, with the people that I'm closest to? How am I reacting to things? And so, so step 1, identify.
Exactly. And it's really identify and then do the reprogramming work. So I'll give a tool in a little bit too, but I'll sort of go through the few and then I can come back to a tool for actually how to recondition. But exactly to your point, like we have to know what it is first. And so a great way that people can discover it is whenever we're triggered. So whenever we're feeling stressed or sad or emotional, if we can like really anchor in the situation. So it's when my partner didn't call me back, for example. What do I make it mean about me? And if we can ask ourselves that question, it's a really good way of retrieving the core wound. It's based in cognitive behavioral therapy. And so when we see that, we can go, oh, well, I'm making that mean that I'm going to be abandoned.
Yes.
Or I'm making that mean I'm disliked or rejected. Or I'm making that mean that, I'm with the wrong person, I'm going to be trapped, So we each have like really individual meaning. And when we can look at times we felt really emotional or triggered and ask ourselves, what do I make that mean about me? We'll see clearly what those core wounds tend to be. So that's sort of the first way to pull them up. And then we can do the reprogramming. So
what do I make? So identify, and then what do I make? What was it?
What do I make this mean about me?
What would I make this mean about me? I can so relate to that. The first thing that I thought of when you said that was, I remember when me and my husband first got married, he would have this habit of when he would come into the door, he would leave his shoes right by the door. And I would be in my mind, I would be thinking, what, does he think I'm just going to pick up after him? Is that why he's leaving it by the door? He thinks that it's my responsibility to pick those shoes up and put them away. And it kept tearing away at me over and over again. And when I thought about what that meant for me, it was because I felt insecure about being at that time a housewife where I was staying at home and he was working, and that was a shift that I had just made. And it was something that I felt insecure about. And so constantly, any actions he was taking, which he didn't mean it to be that, my interpretation was, oh, so he's leaving that there because he thinks I should be doing this. And then I spoke to him and he was like, no, I'm so happy doing it. I just, at that moment in time, it's not when I want to pick this up and when I want to do that, but I would have done it an hour later, or I would have done it in my own time. And so the interpretation that I had made for myself was so different to what his meaning actually was.
Exactly.
But it was purely based on my insecurities or things that I felt maybe in the past, or having to look after someone, whatever it was definitely stemming from something far beyond just the shoes that were left in front of the door.
So that's so cool. It's such a good example. So if you go a step further, just tell me if either one of these resonate with you. I don't matter. I am unimportant, or I am disrespected.
I think the I am unimportant definitely stems from even school times where I never felt like I was I was never told or shown that I was worthy to even be in the classroom, because I was always not getting the grades or always not being the person that was performing in the right way to get attention or to get adoration in that way. And so the unimportance thing, I think, has always has been a thread throughout what I'm doing, or like the feeling of being a little bit unworthy, and then you kind of translate it into other things.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so that's like what core wounds come from.
Wow,
they never
this.
come from like actual, like that moment with your husband coming through the door. They're always pre-existing.
Totally.
And then they get activated in those moments.
Yes.
And then it's something where like the shoes on the floor, like, oh, it's just shoes on the floor. But it's, people are like, oh, it's not a big deal. But really, it's not about what the objective experience is. It's the subjective stuff that we have inside of us that arises that feels so uncomfortable.
Yes.
So we do a lot of the work. The first part is like learning exactly what our core wounds are. There's a list of like 18 or 20. I can actually send you a link if you want to put it in the show notes or something. So listeners can like identify theirs.
Yes.
But you can see those ones, and then it's like, okay, then we can plug them into the reprogramming. And then we can actually leave these things that were conditioned into our subconscious mind from pre-existing experiences, which makes us way less likely to jump to those conclusions in the future or feel that distress.
It's so true. I think about all the times where I've kind of jumped to conclusions or had very snappy responses to things. And I'm like, it was such a tiny thing. Like technically it's a tiny thing, but because you allow things to build up so much, it doesn't feel tiny at all. Like that one thing feels so huge because of either things I haven't worked through myself or things that I haven't worked through with other people.
Yes.
That has ended up leaving little scars.
Exactly.
Please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I always tell people, like, it's never, because some people will do that, right? You're probably not doing that as much, but people will shame themselves for having reactions to things like, oh, I can't believe I was snappy over this little thing. And it's because it's never about the external experience. It's always about what it triggers internally for us. And so it's also a reminder for us to be like gentle with ourselves. And if we see ourselves doing that, it's never helpful to like shame ourselves or beat ourselves up for something. It's so important to adopt a state of curiosity and to be like, well, why did that affect me so much? What am I making it mean about me? And then we see, oh, I was making it mean I am unimportant or I'm unworthy. And oh my gosh, there's this like trail of that in my experience. Now it all makes sense.
Gosh, can you imagine how many, well, I'm sure you already know through the work you've done, but how many arguments are saved after people realize these little things? Like, seriously, I can just imagine the clarity of communication and like the clarity of understanding, even if you figure out yourself as being secure, but then you end up noticing those traits in your partner, it helps you to also help them unwind and you know, figure those parts out. Like, where is that coming from? Like, how is what I said, what are you translating it to be? And I remember I heard recently Gabor Mate.
Yep, Gabor Mate.
Gabor Mate is how
I
you
love
say it.
him, yeah.
I love him too. And he was talking about how this was more to do with what other people think about you, but he was talking about how you can never control how someone perceives what you've said, because it's going through all these layers, all these filters of their pain, of their trauma. And so you can say the same thing to 5 different people, and each person will have internalized it completely differently.
Exactly.
And there's this word in Sanskrit, it's called samskaras. And samskaras are tiny, they're described as tiny little footprints that are essentially left on you every single time you go through an experience. But what happens is sometimes they can get washed away when you end up processing them. But otherwise, every single time that same thing happens, the imprint gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I always think about that when I go through life. I'm like, all these little impressions, they're referred to as all these little impressions that are being made determine how we receive anything that we come into contact with.
Exactly. And the meaning we'll give. And it's so funny because this is like how the subconscious works too, is exactly what you just described as the samskaras, which is every time we go through a negative thing that we can't properly emotionally process, our subconscious stores it so that it can protect us from it in the future.
Wow.
But then when we keep giving the same meaning, we're actually firing and wiring those neural pathways. They're getting stronger and deeper. And now you think of your subconscious mind as like the lens you see the world through, where it's almost like every time you have something that like, or like almost like a windshield when you're driving your car and you get these like splats of mud on your windshield and they build up and become dirty and dirtier. And unless you're cleaning them out, it skews your vision.
Yes, that's a great analogy. So with people, you know, I have a lot of friends who get into relationships and, you know, you end up having these patterns where you end up seeking out the same thing over and over again. Is that linked to these attachment theories from a young age? And if you notice yourself getting into patterns, and usually we recognize the patterns usually when they're negative, not when they're positive patterns, how would one, and obviously these are the ways that you get out of it, but when do you know to stop? Like, how do you know to stop those patterns? How do you differentiate it from who you just are as your personality versus something that is wrong with you or something that you have to adapt and change?
Because of how much it's causing us pain.
Oh, yeah.
So I feel like emotions, like they're a beautiful feedback mechanism. Like they're always telling us when something's out of alignment. And sometimes what we do is we shame our emotions or suppress them, but they're always saying something to us. And when we can use them as an opportunity to go inward, we can go in and heal and do that underlying work. And so what's really interesting is that our subconscious mind really wants to maintain its comfort zone. So it seeks comfort because it equates it to familiarity and thus safety. And so your subconscious at the end of the day is really survival wired. So even if we're going through decades of painful patterns in relationships, we'll attract the same type of people and invest in those personalities because we're like, it's familiar and thus I'm still likely to survive.
Yes.
And so what's really interesting is that for each of the attachment styles, we are generally most attracted to what represents the subconscious comfort zone we have in relationship to self.
Oh.
So how we get conditioned as children, we will tend to internalize. So I always say, for example, like our internal dialogue is often our internalized dialogue from childhood, like how we were spoken to, we'll often speak to ourselves.
Yeah.
And so let's say, for example, you had really critical parents, then you become really critical of self. And then you see that you're attracted to really critical people because they mirror back to you how you treat yourself, and thus it feels safe and familiar.
Wow.
And so you'll often see like anxious attachment styles, they're very dismissive of themselves and their own feelings because they're busy people pleasing. So they're more attracted to emotionally unavailable people a lot of the time. Dismissive avoidants are very preoccupied with their own time to themselves, and often they'll be attracted to people who are also preoccupied with the amount of time. So we end up attracting what's our mirror, not into like what we're looking for, but into who we are to self. And that's why it's so important to become securely attached to self first. So we're more likely to be investing in people who are also going to be secure and show up in safe and healthy ways.
See, that puts a whole different meaning to love yourself first, and then you'll find the person that's going to love you best. Like that to me, everyone's like, you have to feel really secure by yourself first before you get into a relationship. But I think the way you just described it, of it being this reflection, what you end up seeking out is a reflection of how you treat yourself, then it makes sense, right? Then you actually want to be in a place rather than someone coming in and trying to fix these broken pieces of you. You then realize, oh my God, I could deserve so much more. Like I could attract so much more in my life, and there's a possibility that I deserve way more, but I need to believe I deserve more first. And I need to believe that things in my own self can be better before I can attract better.
Exactly. And that goes back to like these major things. So it's really interesting. So we talked about like there's the 4 major things.
Yes.
So the first one is core wounds, right? And I have to go through the other ones still.
Yes, let's do it.
But the core wounds, like if I'm telling myself all day I'm not good enough or I'm unworthy, I saw a lot of clients within that 10-year period or so when I was running my practice who came out of also narcissistic relationships, and not like how people throw around the term, but like actual, narcissistic personality disorder. Yes. And it's so interesting because this was like the most obvious example to me. And this is, to be very clear, I'm not victim blaming at all. Yeah. And I'll speak to that in a moment. But what I would see is that every person who ended up in a relationship with a narcissist, they first were very self-critical. They violated their own boundaries to please people all the time. They would manipulate themselves into like becoming what people wanted from them to people please them. And they were often in a position where they were not empathizing with their own feelings. They were like judging themselves for feelings. So of course, somebody comes along who's not going to be very nice to you. Yeah. They're going to be like cruel or mean in how they talk to you. They're going to manipulate your life. They're going to violate your boundaries. They're not going to empathize with you, like all these characteristics of a narcissist. And what happens is the conscious mind is responsible for 3 to 5% of our beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and actions. And subconscious and unconscious collectively are 95 to 97%. And every client that I would see go through this would come into my practice and they would say, I knew better. It was almost like logically, which is our conscious mind. I knew that something was not right. I knew that this person wasn't being healthy, but it was like I couldn't stop myself from going and investing in this relationship.
It's the autopilot, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's almost like this dormant autopilot thing where it's almost like we're asleep. Like it's the subconscious, to me, feels like unless you start tuning into it, it becomes this part of you that is asleep on basically just following patterns that you've already followed before without trying to readjust. Like you have to realign it. But otherwise, living through your subconscious means I'm going to collect all these things that happen. We're going to store it, like you said, and then we're going to live in that same pattern over and over again until you wake up and until you wake me up and start telling me different.
Exactly. Wow. Exactly. And start doing that reconditioning work. And so it's like this whole like landscape of what's happening. So that first part is people learning to reprogram their core wounds, because as long as I have core wounds, like for me, it's so interesting. I saw my parents go through this big sort of, confused dynamic. And I had this huge betrayal core wound. And then I was in relationships as a young person with people who would betray me. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is my subconscious comfort zone. And as soon as I reconditioned that would change, right? So we tend to like actually not just have these core wounds, but then we invest in people who are more likely to activate them. So that's the first. The second part is we need to learn what our needs are. Everybody has needs in a relationship, and actually needs in a relationship are so understated. Yeah. So there's the beautiful work of Dr. Gary Chapman. He talks about the 5 love languages. And I would actually say much more important than the love languages are our needs, because I have a big quality time love language, but I have a big need for emotional connection. Yes. And if I spend quality time watching Netflix with somebody, it's not the same as having like a deep conversation and feeling like that's like a really connecting thing. So our needs are absolutely huge, and they're how we actually give and receive love in a relationship. And when needs are not being met, and not to like fearmonger people listening to this, but when needs are not met, that is the context for usually how infidelity happens long-term in relationships, because the subconscious mind is a needs-meeting machine. And so what will happen is we won't get our needs met, let's say in a 20-year marriage, and then will start to resent. And then somebody comes along who does meet those needs. They do make you feel seen or heard or significant. And the subconscious mind will go through these enormous feelings of infatuation, which obviously this is usually, with the exception of people who are like sex addicts or things like that, the vast majority of infidelity happens in these very drawn out times where needs are not being met. And then the person justifies it and strays. And so every person has needs. We need to learn our own needs and how to meet our needs ourselves first, so that our subconscious mind is ready to receive them from other people and we're primed. And then the third piece becomes we need to learn to communicate our needs vulnerably and transparently.
That's so hard.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Like, it's like, okay, we've done all this work and then you have to learn how to ask for what you need, which I think even more so for women than I think for anybody else. We're just so used to being the people, or being in a position of being givers and being people who are caretakers. It's part of our nature to be that way. And so to then be like, this is what I need, it feels like such a big step and a very vulnerable moment to even do that.
So big. So as a fearful avoidant as well in the past, I remember the first time I communicated a need, and it was to my now husband, and we've been together for like 10 years. Oh. But we were early on into dating, and I had done a lot of this work on myself first, but I hadn't like really done it in a relationship. I took this like kind of time out from dating, like this sacred kind of pause to like do a lot of inner work because I knew that I needed it. And it's funnily enough, he was like the first person I actually dated after coming out of that. And then we got married. But he, like, I remember one time I felt really insecure about something, and it was like this misunderstanding that was happening. And we were only a few months into dating. And I remember knowing, if I don't say right now that I just need like clarity and reassurance, that I'm going to store it and I'm just going to kind of push him away.
Yes.
And I remember like where I was, what I was wearing. It was such a vivid moment because it was so scary. Yeah. But I was like, hey, I'm feeling like a little bit unsure about this situation that's happening. And I need like clarity and reassurance to feel okay. Otherwise, I know I'm going to get in my head, and I don't want it to come out in a different way in the relationship. And he like was so sweet about it. And so and it was the first time I'd ever communicated, and it was like positively reinforced like that. And it was like, oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like. And it's so scary when we haven't done that before. And to your point, like women, a lot of the times too, are like caretakers, and they're not supposed to like have needs or take up too much space. But I think that without that, relationships just often become dysfunctional. And the more we have unmet needs and there's a lack of communication, that goes in direct correlation with how much resentment boils in the relationship. Yes. And so that's the big thing. So we do the core wounds. We identify and reprogram core wounds. We learn our needs and we learn to meet them with self. So if I need encouragement, I better be more validating of self. If I need certainty, how can I create my own certainty with more boundaries in my life or things like that? And there's like each attachment style, we can go through them afterwards too, but each attachment style actually has very unique needs that tend to be there. So we can learn from that what they are, and then we learn to meet them with self, and then we learn to communicate them with others. And then the last kind of piece is we have to develop healthy boundaries. And then we have to do a little emotional regulation just through things that get us into parasympathetic nervous system mode, meditation, breath work habits, just like little things that will help us re-regulate if we come from a history of relationship trauma. And then in doing that, that will shift our behaviors. So really it's like if you can learn your core wounds and reprogram them, learn your needs, express your needs to other people, emotionally regulate, and have good boundaries. It sounds like 5 like things that take a lot of time, but really it's like 90 days for people to really do the reprogramming, do like a little breath work exercise in the morning, you're regulating your nervous system, and then go into your life and learn to understand your needs and communicate them to people and set your boundaries, and really like just conditioning that for 90 days, we'll see people really move into being securely attached.
Yeah, because what you're just saying reminds me of the friends I was talking about, where if they're used to being in similar relationships where it's actually quite painful, the problem is even when a man comes along that is completely different and possibly a secure man, they find it disturbing and they can't even appreciate the man who is secure, communicating, stable. And so it's almost like you lose out on these opportunities to have, because they're always thinking, oh, I just need to find that guy that makes me feel secure, the guy that makes me feel like it's all going to be okay. But the problem is you find that and then it's boring. And you find that and then it's suddenly like, oh, but what else do I do now? I'm just bored and I don't know how to react to this. And so it's almost an unfair position that you're putting the other person in because you're not ready to receive that yet. And so what you're talking about, it kind of makes it's almost like the work that has to be done before an exam, right? You have to do the work that it takes to accept the goodness that comes into your life if you've been in a position that's used to not receiving that.
Exactly. And like, it's so hilarious that you said this because I just recorded a YouTube video. It hasn't come out yet. And it's about how if you're not secure, you'll often find secure people boring.
Yes.
And it's
oh my God.
because so we do these like programs in the personal development school and people all the time. So we'll do like these daily webinars and people will come in and type stuff. And all the time, like I was like, I have to make a video about this and address it because so often people will literally be in there and they'll be like, hey, I'm like seeing this secure person, but I don't know, like I feel like it's kind of boring all the time, like just nonstop. And so you nailed it. And it's because if your subconscious comfort zone, and I actually had that experience firsthand when I was younger and dating, when I was not securely attached. And because my subconscious comfort zone was chaos, I was attracted to chaos. And anybody who was going to make me feel calm instead of chaotic, I would reject because it was not familiar. And even though it's like totally backwards, I would perceive that as not safe because I'm not used to it. And so it's like we want to go back to what's familiar, but sometimes that's not the actual thing that helps benefit us.
Yeah, and the not safe is because you're not used to having to have someone that doesn't respond in ups and downs. And I think that's what it is. It's like the adrenaline rush, right? I think about it even with friends who go on tour and they're on stages, or they're used to people screaming their name and they're so used to this high that can't be experienced anywhere else. And so everything else feels so dull and so boring. And in the same way, it's like if you're used to this pining of, oh my gosh, when is he going to talk to me again? Or, oh my goodness, he's so angry with me right now. But eventually it's going to get better and then it's going to get worse and then it's going to get better and then it's going to get worse. It's this, you're on a roller coaster with adrenaline over and over again. And so when there's no adrenaline rush in that way, you start to think this is really boring.
Yeah, exactly. And something else that I found to be so like useful and honestly is I don't want to say like sad, but it's so important to recognize this is that every relationship as well, it has 6 stages. So this was originally based off the work of Dr. Susan Johnson, but I sort of adapted it over the years. The first stage is the dating stage. It's like our vetting stage. We're supposed to see if somebody's a good fit. Then we go into the honeymoon stage, which is like the rose-colored glasses. That, like the dating stage usually lasts 0 to 6 months. Honeymoon stage, another year or so, sometimes up to a year and a half. Then we go into the power struggle stage. I can't tell you how many times I would have clients come in when I was running my practice and they would be like, I married my wife at a year. We moved kind of quickly. And then as soon as we got married, she turned into a monster. Like I would hear story after story like this. And it was like, no. It wasn't like she was trying to bait you to get married and then become someone else. It's just that you're in the power struggle stage now. And if we make it out of the power struggle stage, we go into the security, commitment, and bliss stages. And the bliss stage is like the honeymoon stage, but where you deeply know somebody. You really let them in, you know their fears and flaws and you've accepted each other's and there's like a lot more communication and openness. And that's where we're trying to get to. But most people who are insecurely attached, they go dating stage, honeymoon stage, power struggle stage, break up, start again. So they also don't realize that like love isn't supposed to be the high of the honeymoon stage or the low of the power struggle. And they keep trying to like keep the highs and the lows alive. Because what you'll find is if you make it out of the power struggle stage, love is less about like the highs and lows of almost like that pleasure seeking and more about this really deep fulfillment. And that only happens when we build those deeper roots and when people don't realize that that's how it works and they don't know their attachment style. It's like we go in blind to love and relationships and it keeps us so easily stuck with the wrong expectations or rules for love.
One of my best friends is exactly like this, and she'll know when she's listening to this that I'm talking about her, especially in my mind. But that's our conversation over and over again. She keeps saying, oh, I want it to feel like it felt when I was younger and dating in relationships. Like when I'm meeting people, it doesn't feel that exciting anymore. And it doesn't. And I was like, but all those people you broke up with. So there was a reason that didn't work out. But she's constantly seeking this she's like, what about the butterflies and the excitement? I was like, you still feel that, but it just feels it's a different type. Like the excitement is different, but in a good way.
Yes.
The butterflies are there, but it's not as intense. And I think it's the intensity that people are so used to.
Yes.
That intensity of emotion. And it's almost like you just want to feel something. Even if it's a bad feeling, you just want to make sure you're feeling.
Yeah. Totally. And we get addicted to the neurochemistry of our core wounds. When they're up, we get not just cortisol, but also dopamine. And it's actually very similar neurochemically to what people get addicted to when they're gambling.
Wow.
And so, and like the intermittent reinforcement.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's there for that reason. But I would say, and I'm curious, like you probably noticed this, but I would say, we can sort of share about this as people probably for anybody who hasn't had this experience. Yeah. But I would see this with tons of people, both in my practice or through our programs. And people, it's like pleasure seeking can only go like this high and this low, but fulfillment can outgrow the peaks of pleasure. Like when you have such deep fulfillment and really deep connection and peace and appreciation and gratitude, like all of those things, they grow slower, but over time, the depth of fulfillment won't, like the pleasure of like the roller coaster doesn't hold a candle to how fulfilled you feel. No. But people, because they're not getting the opportunity to go through the stages and get to that point, have no reference or context. And so they keep seeking out those highs and lows.
Yeah, I always just think, why should the person that I'm spending my life with make me feel the same way I feel when I'm in the most anxious stages of my life? Like the things that scare me the most, if you're feeling the same way with your partner as you do doing the things that scare you the most on a daily basis, that doesn't make sense. And I think about it all the time, like, oh, the way that it should be is my nervous system feels soothed when I'm with my person. Like I feel at ease and calm. But again, it's what you're saying. It's when that's not your normality. It feels like the being in anxiety feels so much better for you than being in a state of calm and ease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who I work with in the school, and they come in and they say, hey, I've become securely attached and I'm dating somebody now, and I can't tell the difference if I don't like them or if my attachment style is just not activated. And I'm like, you're going to know if you don't like somebody, and you'll still have the butterflies. Like you'll still have those good feelings and like a little bit of nerves if you're interested in somebody and that excitement, but there's something called like your attachment style being activated, which is when your wounds are on. And a lot of people actually misperceive when they're not securely attached that, oh, my wounds are activated. I'm feeling really anxious, or I'm feeling really avoidant or stressed, and that must mean I like this person. And it's like, no. There's a difference between infatuation in a good, healthy, rooted way versus your attachment style being in that chaotic space.
Yeah. Oh my God. When I was reading your book, you talked about in anxious attachment, you were talking about the difference between sacrifice and compromise. I would love for you to go into that a little bit, because I found that really interesting.
Yes. It's a really important concept for people who are either anxiously attached or even just like leaning anxious, like fearful ones have that anxious side as well. So generally what happens is we often tend to go into a space of thinking, okay, I'm going to do what I think you would want me to do. I'm not going to communicate about it. I'm going to try to mind read you. And a lot of times, like the deeper level of this is actually something called covert contracts, where we basically think, I'm going to kind of buy my future favors for you through doing a bunch of things now.
Wow.
And we track it, and we're like, I'm going to do these 5 things. So when I need to ask you for this thing next week, you're going to owe me. And this is like often behavior we learn when we grow up in a household where we're taught we have to people please, or we can't really be ourselves, or we can't communicate about our needs or get them met. And so that's sacrificing. That's going against ourselves to please others, and it will always end in resentment. Compromise is we learn to communicate our needs openly as a couple or as a unit. Even like, let's say you and I are living together, we're super close friends. Like even in that kind of relationship, it can be with friendships, family relationships. We want to be fully transparent and be able to say, hey, here's what I am available for, and these are my needs, and what are yours? And compromise means we actually both honestly put our cards on the table, and then we work through to find common ground. And what that does is it prevents her from being resentment, and also both people feel seen and heard. Like when we actually get into relationships where we share our needs with somebody and they hear us out and they meet them and vice versa, and we know that we can talk those things through, there's such a deep sense of fulfillment and safety in that. And so compromise means we can actually be honest and authentic and truthful with the people closest to us. And when we do make those compromises, we take ourselves into consideration in the process. So I often give an analogy for people too who are newer to this concept, where let's say my neighbor says, Thais, I want you to come over on Friday, and let's say it's Thursday evening, and they're like, I need you to help me move. I'm moving, I'm packing all my stuff.
Yeah.
Can you come over at 6 p.m. and help me till 2 in the morning? You know, let's say I love my neighbor and I really want to help them because I really care about them. I'm not going to sit there and go, okay, 2 in the morning. If that's not something that, you know, if I have a busy Saturday the next day, or if that's something where at the end of a busy week, I'm not available for that. So what I would do is I would take myself into consideration and think and feel into myself and be like, well, what am I available for?
Yeah.
And maybe I say, you know what, I can't come that late, but I can come at 6 o'clock till 8 o'clock, or 6 until 10, or I'll come at 6 until 8 o'clock and I'll cook you some dinner and bring it over too. Like, and so that's also part of the construct of making compromises is we don't lose our frame of reference, being attuned to ourselves when we make those decisions. And so because we do that, we never feel resentful because we're actually acting in relationships in an authentic way based on our truth.
And when I was reading through your book and even listening to you now, when I first started dating my husband, he was definitely a secure, and I think I was a dismissive avoidant. And it's been such an interesting journey because he's always held space to help me grow, and like all the things that you're saying, I'm like, gosh, he really did do that. Like he's been secure since we started dating, and he's remained that way throughout our relationship. But he's also the type of person who's kept the space open for me to have my journey to grow through that. And that makes such a difference because I imagine it can be very frustrating for someone who is secure and having someone who is constantly battling certain things and battling against him when he's not fighting against me. Do you know what I mean? Like he's always there to hold the space, and I'm fighting him, but against things that I've had from my past, not him. So he's like, I'll carry your bags. And I'm like, why should you carry my bags? I can carry my own bag. And he's doing it out of love, not because he thinks I can't look after myself, but I have a wound that feels like, oh, people think I can't look after myself, that I'm all over the place and I'm going to forget things. And so, no, you can't hold my bags. I can hold my own bags. And so we've gone through and slowly as I was reading through the book, I was like, gosh, I really did do those things when we started dating, where I'd be fighting a cause, but the cause wasn't him. It was me trying to fight something of other people in my past or other things that I'd been through. But it was all coming out through the way he was treating me in such a sweet way. And I was like, no, you're trying to be loving? No, I don't want it.
I totally understand.
Yeah.
So my husband, when I met my husband, was dismissive avoidant as well. And so I like very much understand him, and he's been amazing. Dismissive avoidance, like if they show up and they like do the work and are mindful, and like they're so sweet because they're like so empathetic and they're very caring, and it takes them a little bit to feel safe being vulnerable enough to express it.
Yes.
But on the inside, that's really a part of who they are. And so what's so beautiful about their journey to being secure, and I saw this so much in my husband, is like, as you sort of peel back the layers and as he felt safer and safer to like kind of drop his guard and like let me in, it's like this very like just beautiful soul.
Inside.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's so cool to see that journey too. And it's beautiful that you've been through that.
Definitely. I think I'm still going through it, but I definitely have improved. Another part that you spoke about was the concept of enmeshment. And, you know, being from Indian culture, it's something which is quite normal in our culture to constantly put what your ideas and constructs are of what your child is and what you want them to be based on your own fears or own insecurity. You know, my parents came as immigrants to the UK. And so a lot of what their traumas that they'd gone through was so much to do with financial security, making sure you get the grades, making sure you have stability in your life, because they lacked so much stability growing up. And so it all made sense to me. But I could see now looking back how a lot of the emphasis and what they put emphasis on also kind of I then carry with me through my life. But their intentions were so sweet because of what they'd been through. But at the same time, it put a lot of pressure on me in areas which I wasn't thriving at, and therefore felt like a lot of my value was based on those things. And when I couldn't perform at those things, it felt like it took away my value, if that made sense. And so if my parents are listening, I love you and you did the best thing in the world. Like, they're incredible parents, but traumas just get passed on in that way. And so the enmeshment, when I read it, I was like, wow, we have to learn, even reading it as someone who eventually wants to be a parent, I was thinking it's so easy. I want my child to do this and I want him to be like this or her to be like this. And then you're constantly building these constructs for them that they haven't signed up for yet.
Yes, exactly.
So could you explain enmeshment for anybody who doesn't know and how that can affect someone's attachment style and going through their life?
Yes, it's such an important topic. I love that you shared that too, because it's like I think it's so nice for people when they listen to hear these like real life examples. And to your point, like when people are conditioned to have an insecure attachment style, parents either already have that attachment style themselves, and so it's just being passed along because they're rules subconsciously about love or what we pass down, or it's people who think that they're doing the best thing for their child.
Definitely.
Like I can't tell you how many times I would see clients who were parents who would be like, oh my gosh, I've learned about this attachment style stuff. I realized I was so tough on my children, but my relationship to why I was tough on my children was that I thought I was preparing them the best I could for the world. Exactly. And so it's never like anybody's fault. It's just a process of recognition and awareness and how we can do that inner work to heal what's necessary.
Yeah, my mum would always, whenever we talk about therapy or things that we've been through in childhood, and I loved my childhood growing up. My parents were phenomenal, but whenever we talk about little things that we think have affected us, she's like, does that mean I wasn't a good mom? I was like, it's not that at all. I can imagine why that must hurt parents so much as well, to know that they've created ripple effects in their children or anything that's been traumatic in their child. But it's also not a reflection of being a bad parent. Like you're not a bad parent because you went through trauma that you've passed on to your child. Like that doesn't make you a bad parent in any way. It just makes you human. And like not a superhero that has healed and done everything that it's so unrealistic to not carry certain things with you through. So for any parent that's listening too, it's like, just because your child has carried anything with them through you doesn't make you a bad parent.
Exactly. And it's so common to have these different attachment challenges. Like it's not this, and it's also not like a diagnosis, like you're stuck with it forever. It's just a set of patterns that we have in relationships. So yeah, absolutely. But to answer your question about enmeshment, so basically enmeshment is that we will emotionally take on others' emotions as if they're ours, and oftentimes we'll follow through with behavior more focused from the outside in rather than the inside out. And this can be common in codependent families. This can be common culturally, absolutely, in some cultures more than others. And this basically teaches us that like we are responsible for everybody around us and how they feel. And there's something called direct enmeshment or indirect. So direct enmeshment will often be that enmeshment is taught. Like let's say you have a brother or a sister and they're going through a hard time. You better skip your soccer game to go be there for your brother because, and so, there can actually be this like teaching of that, or you shouldn't go out on Friday with your friends as a teenager because your sibling needs you. And so that's very direct, where it's taught and even negatively reinforced if you're not operating that way. And then there's indirect enmeshment, which often happens when we have a child who's in a home where they can't understand what their parents are going through, but it's a very hard time. So I can share a story of a client once, and I won't say his name. We'll call him C. Yeah. It's the first letter of his name. And he had a single mom, and she was extremely depressed. And so he grew up in a family where he would always see her like sleeping. He always knew something was off and she wasn't okay. And so he would kind of like do extra cooking or cleaning around the house or take a lot on. And basically she wasn't like trying to make him take on her emotions, but because he could see her in distress constantly, he would internalize that and worry, like, if she's not okay, how am I going to be okay? Because as children, we know that we're dependent on our parents to survive. And so there's this dynamic foster where we can become really afraid if somebody's not okay around us. And so then as adults, we tend to, if we come from enmeshed backgrounds, really take on the feelings of others very quickly. And sometimes that can cause us to like constantly try to get close to them and fix them. Or sometimes we can kind of go through burnout really easily because we're taking so much on, which instead we cope with by kind of pushing away and keeping a distance so that we can just maintain attunement to self and how we actually feel as a means to regulate.
Wow. Intense, but amazing. Can you be a mix of two? Can you be, I'm assuming when you're secure, you can only be secure, but what about the other three? Can you kind of be a mix of all three of them?
Yes. So you can actually like have what we call a primary and secondary attachment style. It's basically that you'll learn different patterns. So you're usually rooted in one. So you can be secure with like anxious edges, like a little bit of anxious, that comes up, but it's not dominantly how you're going to show up. You'll still communicate your needs. You have a little less core wounds, things like that. You can also be fearful, avoidant, leaning more anxious, or fearful, avoidant, leaning more dismissive. dismissive, or dismissive with a little bit of fearful avoidance secondary. So you've got like a little bit of hot and cold, or anxious leaning a little fearful avoidant. But what we don't see is a jump from one to the other. So you won't generally see a dismissive avoidant person who's then, anxious as their secondary. And one of the big differences I think that's important to note is it's based on how you behave. So
I was going to ask, like, what are the symptoms?
Yeah. So dismissive avoidance sometimes will say to me like, oh, but I feel anxious sometimes. Like if I ask someone out and I'm waiting to hear back from them, I still feel anxious. And it's like, well, dismissive avoidants aren't robots. Like you're still going to feel human feelings.
Yeah.
But generally what you'll see is when dismissive avoidants feel a little anxious, they'll tend to deactivate. They'll tend to try to minimize their need for attachment as a means of self-soothing. So they'll be like, well, if it doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. Or maybe they weren't the right person anyways. Yeah.
Wait, did you say that's the dismissive?
Yes.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
So you can still feel anxious, but your way of coping with that anxiety will be to try to
down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because that's how you feel safe.
I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. No, I don't want to discuss what's making me anxious right now because it'll make me more anxious.
Exactly.
I can be your what's the word? The figure that you can show as a dismissive avoidant. Yeah.
I know what you mean, the mascot.
Yeah, so that'll be the mascot.
Yeah, for sure. And so that's the dismissive avoidant. And then you'll see anxious attachment styles when they feel anxious. They keep trying to get closer to people. So they'll do the exact opposite. And in fact, if you take an anxious and a dismissive together, it can be so hard because if there's a conflict or an argument, the dismissive avoidant needs usually some time and space to process what they're feeling, to kind of cool off, and then they'll come back to it. But anxious attachments, they're terrified of time and space. So they're like, no, we need to talk about it right now. And then the dismissive is often like, no, I'm not ready to talk about it right now. And then of course we have like all of the unnecessary chaos that ensues until people find the happy medium through compromising when they know their attachment style and they know how to address these things.
Because I imagine like if you're an anxious attachment person and you're constantly wanting to communicate, but then if you have a dismissive avoidant and they're shutting you down, would the anxious attachment person end up kind of changing their behaviors and how they communicate and almost become a dismissive avoidant as well because they're not given the space to express? Does that make sense?
It's such a great question. It's very insightful because what you're saying and what you're getting at too is like neuroplasticity. Like basically
if
we
I
get
don't have
programmed
the space
through repetition and emotion. It happens over and over again. And so yes, in theory that will happen, whoever we're connected to the most, but generally because that's sparked from big core wounds, often the core wounds and how they're feeling in that situation instead is what reinforces those feelings. So often what you'll generally see is that they'll just go through a really big power struggle until the relationship dissolves because the anxious attachment will keep needing to talk in the moment, and then the dismissive will be like, oh my goodness, like give me a second. And then they'll go into one room and then the anxious follows them, and then you'll usually see this whole thing unfold.
Or I find you get shut down. Like if you get shut down lots of times and then eventually you're like, okay, fine, I'm going to stay quiet. I'm just going to stay quiet. And then you stay quiet, and eventually you just blow up. And so you're like, actually, I wasn't actually trying to avoid it. I was just trying to keep it in.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then you have an anxious explosion.
Yes, exactly. And so generally you'll see it like people will try to not have it go that way, but often that will be the output. And then it'll just be like, I would see couples come into our programs and it would just be like, they're just arguing all the time or they're just like back and forth, like at each other's throats with it. But then it's like, okay, well, if you reprogram your core wounds, you're not so afraid of abandonment or you feel safer to be vulnerable if you're the more avoidant person. And so then like, okay, now we're not so triggered when those things happen. And then when you learn to communicate your needs and talk about boundaries, it's like, oh, it's totally fine. Like, and generally what you'll see people say is the output between like a dismissive avoidant and anxious preoccupied is you'll usually see that they learn for the dismissive avoidant to say, hey, I don't know what I'm feeling just yet. I need a moment to process, but I'm going to take 20 minutes and then I'll come back and talk it out with you and I will be here. And so they can take their space, but they're communicating that they're not abandoning them, that they'll come back.
Yeah, that's nice.
And then the anxious preoccupied knows, okay, like they just need to figure out what they're feeling and they're going to come back to me and then they can hold that space for longer.
Yeah.
And then as they're reprogramming their wounds and those triggers aren't so strong, eventually you just see them have really adaptive, healthy coping mechanisms in relationships.
Communication.
Yes.
changed everything, isn't it?
Huge.
Okay, what would you say are good few, maybe like 3 questions that somebody should be asking themselves before they get into a relationship?
Ooh, I like this question. I would say the first question is, what are my non-negotiables? Because this is something that, although that should seem like such an obvious thing, I cannot tell you how many times I would see people who would come to me and be like, hey, I've been with my partner for 5 years. They said that they never were going to have children. I wanted children. We both thought each other would change, and now here we are. And so like, we need to know our non-negotiables. And that can be, I know for me, if I ever had to start dating again, I would say somebody has to be willing to resolve conflict in a relationship.
Yes.
Like, that would be a non-negotiable, somebody willing to talk things out. Or, if somebody grew up with, I had a client once whose mother passed away from lung cancer. Her non-negotiable was, I will never date someone who smokes.
Yeah.
So like, non-negotiables are different for each person, but knowing our non-negotiables just really helps us avoid really big errors in relationships long-term. So what are the things that, and what a non-negotiable is what are the things that, if somebody exhibited these behaviors or showed up this way in a relationship, you staying in that relationship would be a betrayal to self.
Okay, yeah. Because I was going to say, sometimes non-negotiable, I was going to ask you how you know whether non-negotiables are valid.
Yeah.
I mean, like, how do you know whether your non-negotiables are fair and valid to the other person, or is it really just about you?
Yeah, great question. And I would say that it's exactly that. It's like, the moment I would stay in a relationship with somebody who did those things, I would be betraying myself, and I would feel like, wow, this is me going against my truth.
And so these are non-negotiables more to do with personality and behavior rather than non-negotiables to do with externals like finances or attributes, like physical attributes, or can they be the non-negotiables?
That's a great question. Those can be the non-negotiables.
Okay.
Like, I've seen people who came from a family upbringing where their parents divorced and they lost everything. And their non-negotiable is like, I'm not going to get with a partner who has more than X amount of money in debt.
Yes.
Or I'm not going to marry the person if that person can't manage their money. Or, so there can definitely be those things. Physical attributes, I would say less so, but it can still technically be there. But I would say those are more like our preferences than non-negotiables. But sometimes non-negotiables can be literally like around money or things like that. Usually it's if there's this relationship to like safety that a person has.
Right, there's a deeper meaning behind it. Like, it's not the finance, it's what it represents for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so number 1 is, what are your non-negotiables?
Yes.
Any other questions?
Number 2, what are my standards or needs? Okay, we can kind of use them interchangeably in this context. So just like the things that I'm actually looking for from a relationship. And the reason this is really important is because most people go into dating on autopilot. And when they don't know their standards, they're working from their autopilot framework, which is usually their pre-existing core wounds. Often they're deeply unmet needs from childhood. They're expecting people to kind of meet without like being able to articulate them. And we have to spend our dating stage of relationships vetting. Like, if we don't do this, we're not dating intentionally.
Yeah.
And then, somebody may be in a period where they don't want to date intentionally. They just want to like date people and see what they learn. But like, we ideally want to be clear about what we're looking for. And ideally, the dating stage is best done if I know what I'm needing, the other person knows what they're needing, and we're able to vet during the dating stage by asking like one question per date to get to the bottom of those things. So if I knew that like a really important thing for me is somebody who's also interested in personal growth, for example, I might on a date say, hey, I love personal growth. I'm reading these kinds of books. Do you like this stuff? And so we would just ask the question. I think sometimes people hear the standards and needs and they're like, I'm going to sit down with my paper and I'm going to ask 74 questions on date 1. And it's like, no, it's going to feel like a job interview. But knowing what we're actually looking for is extremely important.
Yeah.
And then I would say number 3, how do I actually feel when I'm around this person? Because we do a lot of the I'm this person's dismissing me and they're not looking out for me, and that's my comfort zone for how I treat myself. So I'm going to dive in there head first. And then wait, but if that's triggering you, that's either for you to work out in your triggers or for you to communicate about and see if the needle moves, or probably both. And so just being mindful of like what our actual experiences and our emotions. I can't tell you how many times I would see people never giving up on their ex. And then I'd be like, well, how did this person actually make you feel the entire time you were with them? And they'd be like, oh, like really bad.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, well, why are you chasing them right now?
Yeah.
And so just depending on like if it's just an attachment style clash or if it's maybe somebody totally different who has like narcissistic personality disorder or just isn't healthy, like we have to be able to attune to ourselves and notice how we actually feel in that person's company.
Those are great questions to ask
Thank you.
yourself. I loved what you said in the second one about intentionally dating because I feel like I can't remember where I heard this, but it's like you have to do the work at some point. So you can have fun for a year, for 2 years dating, but then you get married and the work starts because then you start noticing. And so the work has to be done. You can choose when it happens. And so either you end up having to do extra work once you're married and start thinking that you know someone, but you haven't done the depth of the work to figure that out, or slowly, in small little ways, as you keep dating, you start asking those questions. You start intentionally doing that work. So either you don't waste your time or you don't have it's almost like leaving your homework till the last minute. You know, when you know you have to do it. That was me always. I know I have to finish my dissertation, but I am up the night before trying to cram everything in and so anxious when I'm doing it. And so it's either you do things as time is going on, or you suddenly realize you've bombarded yourself with all this work that has to be done in the relationship. And when you start realizing it all at once, imagine the pressure that it puts on that relationship.
Exactly.
In your honeymoon phase of when you've just got married and suddenly you start noticing all these things that you had no idea about in the 2-3 years of dating because you were busy having fun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, because some people will be like, well, I don't want to do the work. The work is work. And I'm always like, you know what? It's way more work to try to not do the work because it's going to get really big and there's going to be a lot of work at some point. Or you're going to find yourself floating from relationship to relationship going, oh my gosh, why are relationships so hard, until you do that inner work for a period of time.
See, my mom's always right. Don't leave your homework till the last minute. Okay, don't leave your homework till the last minute. What would you say are questions? You mentioned, asking certain questions on dates. What would you say are the questions you should ask your partner? Do you have like 3 questions that if you're in a dating environment or you're starting to date someone, what would be 3 questions that you recommend asking?
That's a great question. I would say number 1, like, what is this person actually looking for? And I think having that question in there, I don't think that has to be like date number 1, but I think that when somebody's more secure and they're rooted in themselves, like, that's something you ask when you're a few weeks into the dating stage, because if you don't have the security to just like have the dialogue or conversation, and if you're looking for something different than them, even if you're compatible in lots of ways, if you're different in different stages of life, like that actually just becomes a non-negotiable.
Yes.
So like, what are they looking for like in this season of their life in regards to dating? But also, what are they looking for in a partner? I would say would be number 2. Like, what are those important qualities and characteristics? And it goes back to this like part where vetting should be reciprocal. Like, we're not just supposed to vet. It's funny because different attachment styles may do this in different ways. So anxious attachment styles will kind of like find somebody attractive and like them, and then they won't vet them at all. They'll just people please them and try to win them over.
Yeah.
Dismissive avoidance, sometimes because they get afraid of being vulnerable, can flaw find a little bit when they get too close. So they can be like a little nitpicky of people because they don't want to feel like, oh yeah, this is a perfect connection, or they don't want to like them too much or put them on a pedestal. So they'll kind of like flaw find a little bit. And the balance is what we're ideally looking for. We're looking for, I'm going to vet you and look for the qualities that you have and see if those are a good fit for my life without being too in the flaw finding space. And I'm also going to, make sure that I'm clear about your qualities, and I'm going to open up about my own so that you can see if I'm a good fit for you.
Yes.
And so it's not people pleasing, but it's being open and vulnerable and transparent so we can see if this is actually something that could work. And so I would say those are 2 really important questions. And I would say the third question is really going to be about like, what are your non-negotiables around dating? Because again, when we can get that super clear, we put ourselves in a position where we're just not like wasting our time, and we're able to do things so much more intentionally.
Thank you. Those are great questions for people. I actually had written down the question of, does your style make you that way towards yourself? And you've already answered that, but it was really interesting to me when I read my question after going through the attachment styles and reading the book, that I didn't even, in my mind, I wasn't sure. Like, I was like, but what's crazy to me is that you don't expect them to be something you do to yourself.
Yes.
Like, I think you could I think you could go through these attachment styles and be like, yeah, he presents as this and I present as this to him or to her. But thinking about the fact that I do it to myself,
Yes.
I didn't connect the two.
Yeah. And that's like, I think so important for anybody listening to flush
Yeah.
out. So like dismissive avoidance sometimes will neglect their own emotions because it's that internalized emotional neglect, and sometimes kind of like push things down or like stuff it away or avoid it a little bit.
Like that because there are other people in the world going through this, and this.
Yes.
And so why should I feel sad about this?
And that's like in its own essence, it's this beautifully packaged emotional denial, right? Because it's like, oh, like other people are going through harder things. So I'm not allowed to have or be entitled to my feelings, which is just emotional neglect of self in a different form. And so, and you'll see like for each person, they are that to self, right? Anxious preoccupieds are people pleasing everybody else, but in that they're literally abandoning themselves all the time. And so no wonder their abandonment wound is so strong, is because they're keeping it alive. Like I always think of when we don't know how to meet our own needs, and this is very like anxious attachment style. Like imagine that you have an anxious attachment style and they're driving to a gas station and their gas tank is fully empty. You pull into the gas station and you're like, oh my God, it better be open. You're panicking.
Yeah.
But if your gas tank is always halfway full when you pull in, if this gas station's not open or they're out of gas, you're like, oh, that's fine. I can go to the next gas station because your tank is half full. And that's really what it means to meet our own needs in relationship to self. Not only is it our form of self-soothing, but it's also our ability to not panic and get so dysregulated if somebody's not available to us because we're not running on empty in the relationship to self all the time. And so because they keep themselves on empty there, they fear that from other people. Just like by the same token, like even for a fearful avoidant, which I haven't mentioned, like for me, I would be like all or nothing all the time with myself, like really focusing, doing a really good job for a few days on being kind to myself, whatever, and then drop off and go the full opposite direction. And like you'd see that. And then of course I show up that way in relationships because that's relationship to me first.
Yeah. I think we're not taught to even reflect on ourselves in that way.
Yeah.
Like you read all these things and you're thinking about how am I acting to this person or how is this person acting to me? But the last thing you think about is how am I acting to myself? How am I relating to myself? How am I speaking to myself? And so I think there's such a great exercise to go through. Like start with yourself before you end up thinking about anybody else that you're acting towards or having an interaction with. It makes such a difference.
Absolutely.
Can you tell people, because I mentioned the book briefly, but there are 2 books of yours that I have. Could you share the books with people? Because I think that after listening to this, I mean, how informative was this? This was such a great conversation, but I think for people to know what should the next steps be, I think reading your book would be great. So could you share both your books and just give a little bit about what each of them are?
Yes, thank you. So the first is called The Attachment Theory Guide, and it's kind of like about the attachment styles and how to recognize which one you are. And then there's our second book, which is called Learning Love. And it's all about like, it's really learning self-love and how to bring that into relationships, but it's actually about those major characteristics. So reprogramming core wounds, learning your needs, emotional regulation, the boundaries and the communication. And so we go through and we break down how to recognize each attachment style, but then how to reprogram your attachment style and actually heal it to become securely attached. And we go through all the different like reprogramming exercises and all that stuff.
That's great. So you feel like people are able to do this by themselves without needing the help of a professional. If they can go through go through the books and they're able to help themselves before needing to maybe go out to somebody to do that.
Yes, they're really designed to be that way for sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to tell people like don't ever get support, but it's all designed to be that you can go through and become securely attached through doing that work. Yeah.
Oh my God, thank you. This is amazing. I want to ask you a few questions about you, actually.
Oh, okay.
What would you say is something that people don't know about you that you would want them to?
I would say, I'm not sure if it's like I want them to, but I would say that something I never share is I actually grew up and played soccer. I played Division I soccer, got a full ride soccer scholarship. It was like my passion and like my first really big thing I was obsessed with in my young adult life. And fun fact.
Amazing. And what are you reading and listening to right now? What are your favorite podcasts, your favorite books at the moment?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I feel like I love A Course in Miracles. I'm really into like a lot of the spiritual stuff. And so every morning I listen to like an hour-long Course of Miracles podcast, go through like the daily lessons. They're so good. It takes a bit to like, I didn't get into it right away, but I'm really into like the spiritual side of things too. And so I love that. That's like my like deep, peaceful activity. And then I'm reading Dr. Gabor Mate's book. One of his newer books that he wrote, I think with his son, it's called The Myth of Normal. And I love all the stuff where he talks about like the body and how this is affected. And I'm also reading this other book because I'm really interested in a lot of health related things too, called The Root Cause by Isabella Wentz.
Okay.
And it's like one of the best health books I've ever read. It's so good. So yeah, really good ones.
Amazing. And what are you working on at the moment? Are you excited about anything in life that you're ready to share with people?
Yeah. So we are, we have the personal development school. We have like all these programs. They're like more immersive programs for becoming securely attached. We do these like 90-day boot camps.
Yeah.
And I'm working on creating this certification for people to also get like certified in all these different things.
Amazing.
So excited for that. And then I'm working on preparing to have a baby in a year or so. Like I'm like, we're going to maybe start the process, my husband and I, in a little bit. So like that's sort of a personal thing that I'm working on.
I love that you shared that because I think the preparation, Ayurveda talks about that all the time, how when you're thinking about having a child, you need at least a minimum of 6 months, if not a year, to start not just preparing your mind or your external environment, but your physical body, and to invite, your in your spiritual state, your mental state, and your physical state, to be prepared to invite a beautiful soul into your body and into your life. And so I love that you said that you're preparing for that, because I think it is something that is it's a responsibility, and it's something so magical that happens, that to spend the time to prepare for it is so important.
Oh, that's so cool. It's so cool to hear that. I've never heard that before. I really like
I'll
that.
share some books with you on it. It's really beautiful.
That.
Last question. When was the last time you cried?
Oh my gosh.
Are you a crier?
I'm a crier. I can cry very easily. I cry happy tears a lot more now than sad tears, but I will say my poor dear sister is going through a hard time physically with some health stuff, some really serious health stuff. So I cried a few days ago about that. Yeah. We were really worried about her. She had to go to the hospital.
I'm sorry to hear that.
She went through a lot of like heart issues, and she's really young. So that made me cry. I feel like if I talk about it for too long, I'll cry on your podcast.
No, you didn't have to go into details, but I appreciate you doing that. And honestly, everybody that's listening to this, say a little prayer for your sister. And I wish her well. And thank you so much for this. This was phenomenal. I can't wait for all of you to listen to this. And when you do, please go and find Thais and share all your thoughts, and give her thanks if you appreciated it. Thank you all so much. Subscribe to the podcast, and would love feedback, whatever it is. Thanks so much.